Before today's video, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on the latest videos. If you want to see a case or topic covered by Paranormally Listed, then go to criminallylisted.com and fill out the questionnaire under the Suggest a Case tab. Number 3. Mark Foster. On July 19, 1997, a man's body was found beside the road in Dairyland, Wisconsin, which is near the Wisconsin and Minnesota border. He had been shot once in the chest with a high-caliber rifle. The gun was not at the scene. One thing that immediately caught the attention of the police was that he was dressed from head to toe in white clothing. This included his belt and shoes. In one of his socks, the police found a piece of paper with writing on both sides. One said, quote, "Jack Frazier isn't here, but it's Jimmy Bailey, or do they look alike?" Unquote. On the other side it said, quote, "Geez, it's three toughs, hope I'm okay," unquote. The police had no idea what the note meant. They identified the dead man as 45-year-old Mark Foster from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Minneapolis is about 140 miles away from where the body was found. Mark's nephew, 24-year-old Brent Thompson, had reported him missing the morning his body was found. Mark was a married father of four who worked as a pharmacist. Before his recent stint as a pharmacist, Foster had owned a tech business, but not a press. The business published CD-ROM databases. Foster founded the company in 1988. When they launched, they were one of only 4 companies in the USA producing CD-ROMs. One of their most notable titles was the CIA World Factbook. Because of his work, Mark met with Vice President Al Gore when he came to Minnesota in 1993 to campaign. By 1993, Quinata Press was the biggest source for CD-ROM titles in the United States. In 1994, they brought in around $2 million in revenue. Mark Foster liked to spend his money. He rode around in pink limousines, ran up huge bar tabs, and took trips to Europe. The police surmised Mark was kidnapped, possibly to extort some money, and then he was murdered on the side of the road. Before his death made the news, the police interviewed 3 people who were close to Mark: his nephew, 24-year-old Brent Thompson, his roommate, 24-year-old Greg Feisner, and his 4th and current wife, Sarah Phillips Foster. They said 2 men, Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey, were threatening Mark. They wanted him to get drugs for them. Also, both men had been romantically involved with Sarah before her marriage to Mark. She had a 6-year-old son with Bailey. Thompson said they last saw his uncle around 2 a.m. on the morning he was killed. He was going to meet Frazier and sort things out. The police thought that their behavior was odd. For example, none of them had asked how Mark had died. The police investigated Frazier and Bailey. It turns out that Sarah had been with Frazier until February 1997. Then she moved out and into Mark Foster's home. Sarah was the sister of Mark's 3rd wife. Mark and Sarah married on April 1st, 1997. The following month, there was a custody hearing regarding Bailey and Sarah's son. Frazier and Mark were both at the hearing. Frazier supposedly threatened Mark. Bailey lost the hearing, and allegedly he assaulted Mark and Sarah. The police interviewed Jack Frazier. He said that when he read about Mark being murdered, he thought that Sarah might be trying to set him up. It turned out that Frazier had an airtight alibi. He was over 1,400 miles away in Salem, Massachusetts. He had baggage claims and receipts to back up his alibi. Bailey also had a strong alibi, so they were both eliminated as suspects. The police talked to Mark Foster's son and daughter. His son said that his father owned a .44 caliber carbine rifle, but it was missing from the storage unit where it was stored. The police got surveillance footage from the storage facility. The day before Mark's death, Mark was recorded going into his storage unit and retrieving the gun. He left the facility and got into a vehicle with 2 or 3 other people. They also learned from Mark's son and daughter that he followed a religion called Tantra. Some believe that part of Tantra is being sexually open. Mark's children said he had sex with both men and women. There were several people living at Mark's home at the time of his death, and he had sex with all of them. Then the police talked to Mark's ex-girlfriend. She shed a lot of light on his religious beliefs. She said that Mark believed he was a voodoo priest. He had a small cult that consisted of 4 or 5 people. He claimed he received his spiritual powers by shooting his teacher to death during a voodoo ceremony in a cemetery in New Orleans, Louisiana. When he killed his teacher, he inherited their soul and all the souls of the people that the teacher had killed. For months, Mark had been saying Gregory Feisner was destined to kill him and receive his powers. The police talked to several other people who knew Mark, and they all said that Mark strongly believed in voodoo, and he believed he was a high priest. Mark performed voodoo rituals in his attic. The police also found a lot of books about voodoo and voodoo paraphernalia in his home. However, the police never found evidence that Mark killed anyone in New Orleans. He also told several people that Feisner would take over when he died. The police then found a videotape recorded by Mark hours before his death. It was a farewell video to his family. He said he was going to the other side to meet ancestors, and he was not afraid to die. The police believe that Mark Foster arranged his own murder with the help of Sarah Phillips Foster, Gregory Feisner, and Brent Thompson. It turned out that Mark was in financial trouble. He had failed to reinvest money into his business, and the competition in the CD-ROM field was expanding. In September 1996, he had to go back to working as a pharmacist. In February 1997, he shuttered the CD-ROM business. At the time of Mark's death, he was deeply in debt and owed a lot in back taxes. About 3 weeks before Mark was killed, he had taken out a life insurance policy on himself for about $300,000. The beneficiaries were Sarah, Thompson, and Feisner. The police also learned that federal authorities were investigating him for illegally selling drugs. About 18 months after Mark Foster's death, Brent Thompson went to the sheriff's department and told them what happened the night Mark died. He confirmed that Mark had arranged to be shot. His death would solve many problems. If Mark were dead, he wouldn't have to worry about debts or the investigation into his drug sales. His beneficiaries would get paid. He would be able to transfer his voodoo powers, his soul, and the souls of other murdered teachers onto Feisner. Finally, he could frame his enemies. Thompson said that he drove Feisner and his uncle to the area. His uncle was dressed in his ceremonious clothes. Feisner was wearing overalls and a gas mask. Mark ordered Feisner to aim at his heart. Feisner aimed the rifle and pulled the trigger, but the gun didn't fire. Mark grabbed the gun and loaded a bullet into the chamber. Feisner aimed the gun at his heart again and pulled the trigger. This time the gun fired, and 45-year-old Mark Feisner was hit in the chest. Thompson said they left the body there, and he dumped the gun in the St. Croix River. In July 2011, 29-year-old Gregory Feisner and 29-year-old Brent Thompson were charged for their roles in the death. Even though Mark had arranged his death, the 2 men were still not legally allowed to kill him. In January 2003, 29-year-old Gregory Feisner pleaded guilty to second-degree intentional homicide. He was sentenced to 10 years of prison. Brent Thompson pleaded guilty to being a party to second-degree murder and obstructing the investigation, and he was sentenced to 3 years of prison. Sarah Phillips Foster was never charged in connection with Mark's death. Number 2. Clementine Barnabet. On the night of November 13, 1909, or shortly after midnight on November 14th, there was a horrific mass murder in Rayne, Louisiana. Edna Opalupis, her husband, and their 3 children, ages 4 to 9, lived in a 10-foot by 12-foot cabin. That night, her husband was out for the evening. He returned home after 1 a.m. and found his family hacked to death with an axe. Edna had been dismembered, and the children were mutilated beyond recognition. A posse was formed, and they searched for the killer, but the killer eluded them. 2 years went by, and no arrests were made. Then, on January 26, 1911, Walter J. Byers, his wife, and their child were found hacked to death in their home in Crowley, Louisiana. Crowley is about 7 miles from Rayne. It's believed that the killer entered the home through a window at the back of the house. He left the axe at the crime scene. The killer struck again 3 weeks later in Lafayette, Louisiana, which is about 15 miles east of Crowley. Alexander Andrus, his wife Minnie, and their 2 children, 11-year-old Agnes and 3-year-old Joachim, were the victims. They were all killed in their sleep with the blunt side of an axe that was left behind at the crime scene. 2 days after the triple axe slaying, the police made an arrest in the case, Raymond Barnabet. Raymond wasn't a stranger to the authorities. His family moved to Lafayette in 1909, shortly before the first murders. Raymond worked as a sharecropper. He was known to the authorities because he was a drinker with a short temper. He also abused his children. The police arrested Raymond because his mistress told them he had confessed to the murders after they had a fight. But Raymond was released because of a lack of evidence and motive. After Raymond was released, more families were murdered. The killer moved away from Louisiana and broke into a family's home in San Antonio, Texas. They murdered 52-year-old Alfred Castaway Sr., his 37-year-old wife, Elizabeth, and their children, 6-year-old Louise, 3-year-old Josie, and 5-month-old Alfred Jr. Alfred's dead body was in his bed, and his daughter Louise was at the foot of the bed. The backs of both their heads were caved in. Elizabeth was found in another room on a bed with her daughter, Josie, lying across her feet. The 5-month-old boy, Alfred Jr., was also found near his mother. Like the other murders, the murder weapon, an axe, was found in the house and nothing was stolen. Authorities rearrested Raymond Barnabet for the Andrus family murders in July 1911. He was held in jail until his October trial. At his trial, most of the witnesses against him were not strong. For example, his common-law wife, Dina Porter, and his son, Zephyrin, contradicted each other. However, Raymond's daughter, Clementine Barnabet, had some damning things to say. She told the court that on the night the Andrus family was murdered, Raymond came home with his clothes covered in blood and brain matter. She said that her father bragged about murdering the family. She was then forced to wash the clothes. Zephyrin confirmed this, and both siblings admitted that they feared for their life if their father were to be acquitted. But Dina Porter contradicted their testimony. She said she did not see Raymond with blood on his clothes. However, Porter admitted that Raymond had threatened to kill her a month before the family was murdered. A neighbor who lived in the other half of the house also testified, and he said he didn't see Raymond wearing bloody clothes. Raymond did not testify on his own behalf. He sat behind the witness table muttering "goodbye" in Mofutu, which means "I'm gone" in French. He spoke loud enough that the jury could hear him. Despite the contradictory testimony and no physical evidence, the jury found Raymond guilty. A judge sentenced him to death by hanging. Raymond's lawyers appealed the conviction, claiming Raymond was intoxicated during the trial. Before the trial, someone smuggled in a bottle of wine, and he drank it. Also, the jury failed to follow the judge's instructions during deliberations. Raymond sat in jail while he awaited the decision on his appeal. While he was in jail, another family was murdered in Lafayette. On November 27, 1911, Norbert Randall and his wife, Azima, their 3 children, 6-year-old Renee, 5-year-old Norbert Jr., and 2-year-old Agnes, and their 8-year-old nephew, Albert Size, were killed with an axe. Investigators found a child's bloody footprint beside one of the beds. They believe that one of the children tried to escape before being thrown onto the bed and murdered. The intruder shot Norbert in the head, which was the first and only shooting in the string of murders. The rest of the family was slaughtered with an axe. There was another notable difference from the murder of the Andrews family. The Andrews family were killed with the sharp edge of the axe, while the Randall family was bludgeoned with the blunt side of the axe. After the massacre, the authorities arrested Raymond's daughter, Clementine Barnabet. She lived a block away from the Randall house. Like their father, Clementine and her brother, Zephyrin, had a bad reputation in the town. One neighbor referred to them as, quote, filthy, shifty, degenerates, unquote. The police searched Clementine's room. On a latch on the back door, they found a blood stain. Perhaps more damning, the police found bloody clothes in her room. Clementine claimed that the blood was menstrual blood. A doctor examined her clothes, and he said it was not menstrual blood and there was brain matter on the clothes. On January 21, 1912, while Clementine and Raymond were in jail, there was another mass murder in Lake Charles, Louisiana. It was the Broussards, a family of 6. 40-year-old Felix and 36-year-old Margaret had 3 children, 8-year-old Margaret, 6-year-old Alberta, and 3-year-old Louise. This time, the killer left behind 2 written messages. On the wall, the killer wrote, quote, when he maketh inquisition for blood, he forgetteth not the cry of the humble, unquote. The passage is Psalms 9:12 from the King James Bible. The killer also wrote Human 5 on the inside of the door. 2 days after their murders, on January 23, 1912, the police arrested a man named King Harrison, who was the founder of the Church of Sacrifice. The Church of Sacrifice was headquartered near Lake Charles, Louisiana, and they had several churches along the Southern Pacific Railroad, including Lafayette and Crowley. On the night the Randall family was murdered, they supposedly attended a meeting led by Harrison in a house about a block from their home. The police believe that the church was responsible for the axe murders, and the victims were killed as ritualistic sacrifices. Harrison claimed that neither he nor anyone in his church committed the murders. However, Harrison said that he saw Clementine on the night the Randalls were murdered, close to their home. Harrison said he was walking near the Randalls' home, and Clementine told him to leave because 2 men were about to start fighting nearby. Tragically, the murders continued. On February 18, 1912, 39-year-old Hattie Dove and her 3 children, 18-year-old Jesse, 16-year-old Ethel, and 14-year-old Ernest, were killed in their Beaumont, Texas home. Ernest was hit with the sharp edge of the axe, while Hattie and her daughters were struck with the blunt side. The killer wiped blood from their hands on a cloth and left the cloth behind with the murder weapon. The axe belonged to a man who lived 2 blocks from the Doves' home. As the killer walked to the family's home, he picked up the axe. On March 12th, a month after the Dove family murder, another family was attacked in Golden, Texas. 46-year-old Lyle Finucane, his 37-year-old wife, Ellen Monroe, and their 4 children, 16-year-old Willie, 12-year-old Dewey Lee, 11-year-old Jesse, and 8-year-old Alberta, were slaughtered. Lyle and Ellen were killed in one room. A blood trail suggested Ellen tried to escape. Their 4 children were murdered in another room. Investigators found the axe in the yard and a wash basin the killer used to wash their hands. The police also noticed a blood trail leaving the house. They used bloodhounds to follow the trail, leading them to a house where the police found a pair of bloody shoes. They arrested everybody in the house, but the charges were later dismissed. Meanwhile, Clementine, who was still incarcerated, confessed to the murders. She said she killed 17 people and had a hand in an additional 35 deaths. She claimed she was a high voodoo priestess and had a cult with 4 followers, 2 women and 2 men. They drew straws to determine who would do the killing. She claimed they killed the children because they thought it was better than leaving them orphans. She also said the victims were chosen at random. She confessed, quote, "No, these families were not selected particularly. We started out not knowing who the victims would be," unquote. More shockingly, Clementine admitted to caressing the corpses. She said she had not been worried about the police because she had voodoo powers. She said, quote, "We weren't afraid of being arrested because I carried a voodoo which protected us from all punishment," unquote. Doctors evaluated Clementine and they determined she was sane. Many people were accused of being Clementine's accomplices. They were arrested but eventually released due to a lack of evidence. Clementine pleaded religious insanity during her trial in October 1912. At the trial, Clementine confessed to committing the murders. She said, quote, "I am the woman of the sacrifice sect. I killed them all, men, women, and babies. I hugged the dead bodies to my heart, but I am not guilty of murder," unquote. Despite the advice from her lawyers, Clementine wanted her statement entered on the record. She believed that if she were to be found guilty and sentenced to death, she would be saved by an angel riding a chariot of fire. A jury convicted 17-year-old Clementine Barnabet on October 25, 1912. She was sentenced to life in prison at the Angola State Penitentiary near Baton Rouge, Louisiana. After she was convicted, her father was released from prison, and the charges against everyone else who was arrested were dismissed. During her time in prison, doctors operated on her to restore her to, quote, "normal condition," unquote. Prison officials discharged Clementine on April 28, 1923 for good behavior. She had served more than 11 years in prison. There are no records of what happened to her after she was released from prison. She is the only person prosecuted for the mass murders. However, not everyone is convinced she is responsible for the murders. They know that there are other murders that were committed while she was incarcerated. She claimed to have accomplices, but they were never identified. Modern researchers believe that, especially because voodoo was involved, the young black woman was an easy scapegoat. There are theories that a serial killer known as Billy the Axeman committed the murders. Some researchers believe he committed 94 murders. He would break into a home and slaughter an entire family with an axe. This includes the infamous Villisca, Iowa axe murders in June 1912. However, we will probably really never know what happened in Louisiana and Texas in 1911 and 1912. What is known is that only one person was convicted of the murders, the self-proclaimed high voodoo priestess, Clementine Barnabet. Number 1. John Preston Rooks. In the autumn of 1974, the town of Milton, Delaware, had a population of fewer than 1,400 people. 54-year-old Frank Snyder was a long-time and prominent member of the town. He was a former president of the Chamber of Commerce and the president of the Milton Historical Society. He had been a traveling musician, but in November 1974, he and his wife were running a Sunoco gas station just outside of town. On November 29, 1974, Snyder was working alone at the gas station. A customer came in around 2 p.m. and no one was in the store. They checked one of the bathrooms and found a gory scene. In the bathtub, they found the dead body of 45-year-old Frank Snyder. His wrists and ankles were bound with black towels and window blind cords. He had been stabbed 18 to 24 times in the abdomen and the neck with a butcher knife from the deli counter. The knife was still embedded in his chest. The cash from the register had been stolen. It's believed about $100 was taken. The police thought that the crime scene was odd. Snyder was not a pushover. A week earlier, a man armed with a gun had tried to rob him. Snyder fought the man off, and the would-be robber fled the store without any cash. so he probably wouldn't have been bound or led into the bathroom willingly by a man with just a knife. Instead, they concluded that a group of people had overwhelmed him, tied him up, and then stabbed him to death. But no arrests were made in the weeks after the murder. Then in June 1976, about 18 months after the murder, the police made 3 arrests in the case. They arrested 22-year-old George Reynolds, 27-year-old Thomas Young, and 35-year-old John Preston Rooks Sr. Rooks was a truck driver who was originally from Alabama. The police said that Reynolds had confessed to the murder. He said he was the getaway driver and Rooks and Young had killed Snyder in a voodoo ritual. The police said when they investigated Rooks, they ran into problems. People were afraid of Rooks because they believed he had voodoo powers. He was known in the area as Black Jesus or Blue Jesus. After Rooks was arrested, his wife was adamant he had nothing to do with the murder and that he was not involved in voodoo. She claimed she didn't even know what voodoo was and had to look it up in the dictionary. George Reynolds went to trial first in June 1977. When Reynolds confessed, he was in jail waiting trial for a robbery. He said that Snyder was killed in a voodoo ritual and Young did the actual stabbing. Initially, Reynolds didn't say that Rooks was involved. Reynolds was asked why he changed his story. He said he was afraid of Rooks' voodoo powers. It turned out there were 3 deaths connected to Rooks. In July 1971, 54-year-old Nathan Rogers was found dead in a creek in Milford, Delaware. He had been beaten with an axe and thrown in the creek. He was still alive when he went into the water, and the cause of death was drowning. A short time earlier, Rogers had won several $100s from Rooks in a game of craps. 2 other men, Ricky Tolson and Charlie Burrows, were also involved in the murder. They supposedly bragged about it. But just before they were going to be arrested, they died mysterious deaths. Tolson was run down by a car. As for Burrows, he was sitting in a car drinking beer with friends. He was talking about the murder when he opened a can of beer and drank from it. Suddenly, he started vomiting blood. He then choked on his blood and died. The medical examiner could not determine a cause of death. There were no traces of poison or toxins in his system. The star witness for the prosecution was a man named Miles Cuffey. He testified that he heard Reynolds and Thomas Young talk about the murder of Frank Snyder. George Reynolds was convicted of the murder and he was eventually sentenced to life in prison. Reynolds' lawyer said that he believed the verdict was the result of a voodoo hex. John Rooks and Thomas Young went to trial in November 1977. The district attorney said that many people were afraid to testify against Rooks because they believed he had voodoo powers. After the trial started, there were 4 days of closed hearings about evidence and statements against Rooks. The prosecution argued that the jury should hear all the statements and see all the evidence, but the defense wanted to make it inadmissible. The judge sided with the defense. The nature of the statements and the evidence have never been made public. After the 4 days of closed hearings, the prosecution asked to have the charges dismissed so they could be refiled at a later date. But Rooks' lawyer argued it was too late to dismiss the charges because the jury had already been chosen. The judge agreed with the defense, and Rooks was acquitted of all charges. Many people believe that this was more evidence of Rooks' voodoo powers. Thomas Young remained on trial. Once again, Miles Cuffey testified he had heard Young brag about the murder. However, Barbara claimed at the time of the murder, Young was with him at his shop. Young was found guilty of murder and he was sentenced to life in prison. Young's lawyers appealed the sentence. Young's lawyer discovered that Miles Cuffey had lied to get a $2,000 reward. As a result, Young's conviction was overturned in 1982. In November 1982, Young agreed to a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter and he was sentenced to 5 years, so he was released on time served. Young was hesitant to take the deal because he maintained he was innocent, but he wanted to stay out of prison, so he took the deal. Reynolds also appealed his sentence and claimed he was coerced into confessing. When he confessed, he was awaiting trial for robbery. The police thought he knew something about Frank Snyder's murder. They said if he told them what happened, they would drop the robbery charges and give him the $2,000 reward. So he made up the story about Rooks and Young killing Snyder. In 1996, after Reynolds had spent 20 years in prison, a judge ruled that his trial was fatally flawed and overturned his convictions. Reynolds was released in July 1996. Some people believe that the whole situation, including the wrongful convictions, was the result of John Preston Rooks' voodoo powers. The authorities said that after Rooks, aka Black Jesus or Blue Jesus, was acquitted, he vanished and they lost track of him. Whatever happened to him, he has stayed out of the news. If he's still alive at the time of this video, he would be about 84 years old. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. If you did find it interesting, please make sure you subscribe. We'll have a new video about the paranormal every week. If you just discovered this channel, please make sure you check out our other channel, Criminally Listed. We have over 325 videos featuring bizarre but true crime stories. You can find it at youtube.com/criminallylisted. We also have a podcast about cold cases that were eventually solved called Criminally Listed Presents Into the Killing. You can find it on Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and anywhere you find great podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.